Thank you for coming. And as you see, the question of the day is, why is the world in such turmoil? The answer may surprise you. It is not because of the Jews, the Muslims, the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, or even the Syrians. It is not due to the communists, capitalists, socialists, Marxists, or fascists, or not even the SPLC. It is not because of philosophers, or scientists, or politicians, or the military. It is not because of abortionists, homosexuals, pornographers, or child molesters. It is not due to Wall Street credit default swaps, tsunamis, or melting nuclear reactors. No, all these evils are the result of a much higher power. The group I have in mind has the power to mitigate a majority of these evil forces, and to do so, it doesn't need to climb high mountains or tread deep seas. It only has to obey one simple command, a command that can be accomplished very quickly and with very little human effort. But unfortunately, this group, for the last 84 years running, has refused to comply with the command. And as a result, the evil forces have been unleashed on the world as a divine chastisement. A chastisement, I might add, of which this powerful group had been forewarned would come if they did not comply with heaven's command. This group, with little argument, is the most powerful group of men ever assembled on the face of the earth. So powerful that they have no use for guns or bombs. They need only speak, and throngs will either benefit or suffer, here and for eternity. They wield the most powerful force in the universe. A force, if it were to be measured against the four largest earthly powers, Russia, China, America, and Israel, as Isaiah says, those nations would only appear as dust on the scales. So powerful are they that whatever they decide to keep or refuse is also done so in heaven. In a word, the power of God is at their fingertips. No king, no lord, no potentate, no czar, no president, no general has ever had such power. Not even close. All of them combined are like toys compared to the power of this group of men. If you haven't figured it out yet, they are the popes of the Catholic Church. The last 7 popes, to be exact, the ones given the command from heaven to consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. The sad fact is, all the power they possess means nothing unless they use it. Unfortunately, these 7 popes, for one reason or another, have failed to honor heaven and obey the simple command to consecrate Russia. The command, as you know, was given in 1929 and approved in 1930 based on a prior miracle from heaven. But 84 years later, in 2013, we are no closer to that consecration than we were when the command was given. In fact, as the record shows, instead of obeying the command, some of these popes actually made alliances with Russia and the very forces that were against the consecration. The excuses are many and varied. One of the more popular is that John Paul II, by his consecration of the world in 1984, and a tacit attempt to involve the bishops of the world, fulfilled the requirements for the consecration of Russia. But when these devotees are confronted with the fact that John Paul II did not mention the name of Russia, they suggest that if we take the consecration of Russia, performed by Pope Pius XII in 1952, which he did without the bishops of the world, and add that to John Paul II's consecration of the world with a few bishops, the combination of these attempts will suffice for heaven's request in 1929 to consecrate Russia with the bishops. We can only be amused at the length some will go to preserve the status quo. In the end, this kind of contorted logic only traps them tighter. First, the mere fact that John Paul II attempted to fulfill the consecration means that he believed the 1929 apparition was a mandate from heaven. Otherwise, he would have dismissed it as a mere product of childhood fantasy. Apparently, he believed he was required to obey it to the letter. Any deliberate fudging or inadvertent forgetfulness of what precisely was required would not only inhibit heaven from answering the consecration, but also subject the Pope to judgment for disobedience against heaven. Once one admits his responsibility, one is required to carry it out, and there can be no feigning of ignorance. As was the case, for example, with Pope John XXIII, who, after reading in 1959 both the Fatima secret and heaven's demand for the consecration of Russia, decided that the matter was, quote, not applicable to his pontificate, unquote, and refused to involve himself in the matter. Second, if John Paul II was attempting to improve on Pius XII's consecration so as to fulfill Our Lady's demands, why did he not simply name Russia? Why leave out Russia when he knew that Pius XII's consecration was not valid, since Pius left out required elements of the consecration both in 1942 and 1952? Wouldn't it have been much easier and more certain for John Paul II to perform a complete consecration, this time specifically mentioning the name of Russia and having all the bishops involved? If he believed he had already accomplished the more difficult task of involving the bishops, then why not just say the simple words, I consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary? If that was done, then there would be no question that the consecration heaven requested in 1929 was performed as ordered. The simplicity speaks for itself. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that John Paul II did indeed perform a valid consecration in 1984. What should he have seen afterwards? There can be little argument that he should have seen peace in the world, since Russia would have been neutralized of its reign of terror by the power of heaven itself, and all the wars would have been dissipated. But such was not the case. Being troubled by the constant drumbeating of communist Russia immediately after his 1984 consecration, in addition to other wars and attacks occurring around the globe in the 1980s, for example, from 1979 to 1989, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1980 to 1989, the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1987, the Libya-Chad War, the 1980s Nicaragua-Contra War, 1980s North-South Korea conflict, the 1980 to 1994 South African Apartheid War, etc., etc. John Paul II, instead of waiting for the peace promised from a valid consecration, immediately organized the 1986 Assisi interreligious prayer meetings with the express purpose of having the world's anti-Christian religions pray for world peace. His biographer, Cardinal Stanislaw Ziewicz, the author of A Life with Carol and the personal secretary to the Pope, put it this way, quote, John Paul II thoroughly studied the question from every angle. Then one day it all crystallized in a brilliant inspiration. I've realized what we need, the Holy Father confided to me, a prayer for peace with all the religions. The result was the World Day of Prayer for Peace, which was held on October 27, 1986 in Assisi. On the Pope's right was Robert Runcie, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and on his left were the Dalai Lama and other non-Christian delegates, unquote. The motivation for Assisi is revealed in Ziewitz's next statement. He says, quote, "As if to enshrine the historic moment, there wasn't a single battlefield death anywhere in the world that day," unquote. In other words, it didn't matter if dozens of battlefields were occurring before and after October 27, 1986. As long as there was no gunfire on that one particular day, the Pope pretended he had heaven's blessing for one of the most controversial and unprecedented events in the history of the papacy, Assisi. The irony of Ziewitz's statement is that there were more wars and conflicts occurring between 1984 and 2005, the year John Paul II died, than at any other time in human history. And many of these wars and conflicts continue during the reign of the present Pope and the one before him, who also relies on Assisi prayer gatherings instead of consecration of the nation of Russia to bring peace to the world. And this will continue with our present Pope until the consecration is done and done properly. If all the wars in the world are added up during the pontificate of John Paul II, we find more conflicts in that 3-decade period than at any other time in history. I'm going to give you a partial list of the wars that were occurring during this time. And during this time, almost all of which was on the watch of John Paul II, he did 5 consecrations of the world, 1981 to 1984 and 2000, and conducted 7 interreligious prayer meetings with non-Christians between 1986 and 2002, for a grand total of 12 events he conducted in his pontificate specifically for world peace, but with absolutely no peace to show for it. I'm going to run through these 3 at a time, and I'm going to show you all of them just to give you the effect of seeing how much conflict there was in the world. You can look these up on the internet yourself. Just look for wars that occurred in the 20th century, and you'll see a whole list of them. So I ventured to look at other wars that occurred in various parts of history, and none of them came close to the wars that we had during the pontificate of John Paul II. So here we have Afghanistan Civil War, Albanian Civil War, Angola War, Bosnia Civil War, Burundi Civil War, Britain-Argentina conflict, Central African Republic Civil War, Congo Civil War, Croatia-Serbia War. Many of these you'll remember because they were highlighted by the press. Ethiopian Civil War, Ethiopian-Somalia War, Ethiopia-Eritrea War, Georgia Civil War. On and on we go. Iran-Iraq War, Israel and their conflicts, Lebanon, Italy, Liberia, Nicaragua, North and South Korea, '52 in total. Then there were significant bombings and terrorist acts, just a partial list. There we have it. Needless to say, the foregoing evidence creates a blatant contradiction for the Vatican's position. Either Our Lady was mistaken about the forthcoming period of peace following the required consecration, or the Vatican is sorely mistaken. It is one or the other. If the Vatican is mistaken, then the popes for nearly a century have failed to heed a repeated and direct command from heaven to perform a simple prayer of consecration, which has resulted in the incomprehensible loss of millions upon millions of lives and souls. A more tragic scenario for the Catholic Church and the world is difficult to imagine. The contradiction becomes quite obvious if we look closely at the series of events that transpired. After John Paul II performed his defining consecration in 1984 that was supposed to give unconditional peace to the world by the power of heaven itself, for some reason he felt compelled to call all the world's religions together for the specific purpose of praying for world peace. Shouldn't this strike us as odd, if not blasphemous, against heaven? If in March 1984, John Paul II performed a legitimate consecration that was supposed to fulfill the 1929 request, should he not have waited for the peace promised by heaven? His Assisi gathering in October 1986 was just 2.5 years after his March 1984 consecration, which means that the planning of Assisi 1986 must have occurred much earlier, for large events are not put together overnight. So within just a year or so after his 1984 consecration, John Paul II is already fretting about not seeing world peace. Is he thinking that heaven missed its call? Didn't he trust Our Lady and her Son to give what they promised, if indeed a valid consecration was performed in 1984? Hadn't we been waiting for a valid consecration of Russia since 1929? And didn't we watch in consternation as Pope after Pope failed to fulfill heaven's command decade after decade? If the Fatima consecration were finally fulfilled in 1984, would we not have expected heaven to shower us with peace and prosperity after 50 years of virtual hell on earth in the early and mid-20th century? After all, when Pope Benedict XV prayed publicly to Mary for peace to end World War I, within 8 days, on May 13, 1917, God sent Mary to Fatima to tell the Pope that the war would soon end. In the final apparition of October 13, 1917, she provided the miracle of the sun to confirm her message, witnessed by 70,000 people and verified by the secular newspapers. World War I came to an end the next year. It is also odd that John Paul II put such great effort into bringing pagans and non-Christians to Assisi, an effort that must have cost millions of dollars. Yet no effort was made to bring even a representative sample of the world's bishops to Rome to help in performing the 1984 consecration. How ironic that African animists, Buddhists, and dozens of other non-Christian religious leaders came to the doorstep of Rome in 1986, but Rome's own bishops were nowhere to be seen in 1984. And perhaps they would not have come, because many of them had already discredited Fatima as the delusions of childhood fantasies, thanks to the one man the Vatican hired to dissuade them, Father Edward Donis, S.J., back in the 1940s and 50s. Assisi 1986 was then followed by 5 smaller interreligious prayer meetings in the late 1980s and early 1990s, with a grand finale at Assisi in 2002. After Assisi 1986, the Pope thought all was well with the world when the Berlin Wall came down 3 years later in 1989. Many hailed it as a direct result of the 1984 consecration and/or the Assisi 1986 prayer meeting. But very soon thereafter, their castle in the sky came crashing down. Ziewitz tells us that President Bush, quote, did not alert the Pope, unquote, when he bombed Iraq just 1 year later in 1990. Even though at 7 o'clock the evening before, the Vatican foreign minister had received the American ambassador without hearing a single word about the invasion. Ziewitz takes this as a, quote, genuine insult to a fundamentally meek, peace-loving man who followed the way of nonviolence, a slap in the face for a pope who was a witness to God of peace. He was saddened, profoundly so, in fact, unquote. But Ziewitz then tells us the real motive for the sadness. John Paul II is quoted as saying, "I have done all that was humanly possible," unquote, adding that the Pope immediately called together his collaborators from the Secretariat of State in order to decide what steps to take on the humanitarian and diplomatic level, for war presaged tragic suffering for the civil population, unquote. But isn't this precisely the problem? John Paul II did only what was humanly possible, humanitarian and diplomatic maneuvers, instead of doing what was divinely mandated, the proper consecration of Russia. Wasn't it a slap in the face to Our Lady when John Paul II essentially told her that he had a better way to take care of business with the world through political diplomacy that depended on the goodwill of Russia and other nations? As opposed to saying the simple words, "I consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary," which would have targeted Russia as the world's main villain. Wasn't it a tragic suffering for the civil population when John Paul II and his predecessors refused to do a proper consecration for 5 straight decades? Which failure, as heaven itself warned, forced God to use Russia as his arm of wrath against the church and the world, which is precisely what we saw in the 20th century. In the end, the Pope blamed the U.S. president for starting another war in Iraq, but in reality, it was the Pope's disobedience against heaven that paved the way for that war. The castle in the sky suffered a further blow, as Ziewitz describes the next series of events. Quote, "The Gulf War, 1990, might have seemed like a distant incident on the periphery, a situation that would have no significant impact on the general climate of stability. But the war that broke out almost simultaneously in the former Yugoslavia and dragged on for years like a spreading cancer dispelled any illusion that the world had set out on the road to peace," unquote. Here we have one of the closest men to the Pope admitting that the peace they believed was on the horizon in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall was in fact merely an illusion. As such, the first thought that should have entered the Pope's mind was, "I don't have peace in the world because I didn't do a proper consecration in 1984. Or, I don't have peace because I mistakenly believe that my Assisi prayer meetings with pagans and non-Christians were going to be blessed by God." What we have instead is Ziewitz proceeding to do his blind apologetics for the Pope. Even then, Ziewitz shows his own duplicity by downplaying the contradiction between the Holy Father's absolute opposition to the Gulf War and his insistence on the right to humanitarian intervention in the fierce ethnic conflict that was tearing apart Bosnia-Herzegovina, unquote, claiming that the two situations were radically different. Well, perhaps we are supposed to believe that Our Lady promised no more war, except perhaps a few here and there so as not to make her triumph so obvious. Instead of doing some serious introspection and in turn discovering that the best laid plans of mice and men had come to naught, Ziewitz tells us that the Pope decided to up the ante. He writes, quote, "What was needed after the fall of the Berlin Wall was the creation of a new international order. The UN should have focused on putting out the many brush fires that threatened what was already a very fragile peace, but nothing was done," unquote. Thus, instead of repenting of their disobedience and admitting that they had not done what heaven commanded over 6 decades ago in 1929, the clock now registering 61 years of disobedience, the Pope seeks for the ultimate human solution, a new international order of secular power to force peace on the world. Logically, if heaven wasn't going to give them the peace, they would make it themselves. But they needed something even more powerful than the United Nations, which they admit has been a total failure since its inception, but which Pope Paul VI once said was the, quote, "the last best hope of mankind," unquote. Typical of their contradictions, even while the thought of a secular international police force was in their heads, Ziewitz tells us that the Pope kept his options open. He says this, "John Paul II foresaw the new turmoil that was about to appear on the world scene. This was a stroke of providence, as was his realization that laying the foundations for a true peace would require beginning with a basic pillar of religion. He believed that the religions of the world needed to reclaim their decisive role in promoting a culture of peace and in fostering the growth of a genuine solidarity among peoples," unquote. Hence, whatever would seal his legacy as the Peace Pope, that is, a secular police force and or worldwide religious consensus, was permissible as long as the job was done. Either way, John Paul II was determined to show that he did not fail in his mission. Ziewitz continues, quote, "The Pope also treasured an old dream of Bonhoeffer's, a world assembly of Christian churches that would forthrightly proclaim Christ's peace to a world insanely bent on self-destruction. Bonhoeffer, however, never lived to see his idealized peace," unquote. This is just more rationalization of an already out-of-control problem. As much as theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wanted peace in Europe during the Nazi reign, it was precisely because of the heterodox Christianity that he and his liberal colleagues, Bultmann, Brunner, Barth, and many, many others, were teaching in Protestant European universities. That is one of the main reasons God unleashed the Nazi reign of terror. Liberal theology was permeating Europe at this time. Bonhoeffer and his cohorts denied the deity of Christ. They denied the inspiration of Scripture. They denied the virgin birth. They denied the second coming. They denied the miracles of the Bible and just about anything else that was sacred in Christian tradition. Yet, of course, all of them claimed to be Christian. God was certainly not going to give Bonhoeffer peace, for Bonhoeffer never embraced the real peace God wanted to give through Jesus Christ. By the same token, God wasn't going to give John Paul II peace either. Like Bonhoeffer, he had also ignored heaven's commands. As it stands, John Paul II was depending on Assisi 1986 for his legacy, but he had no peace to show for it. Wars and rumors of wars were at an all-time high in the 1980s and 1990s. Even though Russia had been bankrupted by Reagan in a game of financial chicken, Russia merely morphed its evil empire image into a deceptive ploy of perestroika and glasnost. But John Paul II was well aware that underneath it all, Gorbachev and the Red Internationale were vying for a one-world government centralized in Moscow. Besides, Russia had already spread its tentacles of error throughout the world, not to mention that it recovered rather quickly from its financial problems, and is once again one of the leading industrial and economic and militaristic forces in the world. Moreover, the world scene showed no aversion to terror and war. This was no better displayed than the attacks on the World Trade Center that happened on this very day years ago in September 2001, and the subsequent U.S. retaliatory strike on Afghanistan and Iraq, with Libya, Syria, and Iran in the crosshairs. Obviously, there was no period of peace. For all is not well with the world when one of the worst catastrophes in its history is caused by the warring nations who, ironically, have also been meeting for decades at the United Nations in the same city as the catastrophe, seeking for an elusive peace. Unfortunately, with the drums of war still beating, John Paul II's next move is not an introspective reevaluation of his 1984 consecration. Rather, it is the planning of yet another Assisi prayer meeting in 2002 with the same pagans and non-Christians, a prayer meeting, we must add, which came on the heels of another consecration of the world in 2000 and was motivated by the same problem: no peace to show for all the prayers that were said for the 16 years prior at the first Assisi meeting in 1986 until the second one in 2002. In fact, the 2002 meeting was even more elaborate than the 1986 version. But almost as if God was laughing from heaven at the Pope's "I have done everything humanly possible" mentality, even bigger bombs pummel Iraq the very next year, 2003. And thousands of more souls died, many of them Catholic Christians, at the hands of the very wars that Our Lady promised would come if the Pope did not obey heaven's command to consecrate Russia. John Paul II's "I have done everything humanly possible" stance was also commandeered by the Vatican in an effort to coerce Sister Lucia to change her view of the 1984 consecration. She had publicly stated on several occasions that the 1984 consecration was not valid, since it did not include a specific reference to Russia and did not involve the world's bishops. But her consistent testimony was suddenly changed in 1989 and throughout the 1990s. Sister Lucia, the epitome of innocence and honesty, was now reported to say that the 1984 consecration was valid. Why? Because of a Vatican mandate coming from the Pope himself that told her to do so. Beginning in 1988, the Vatican sent letters to Sister Lucia and various prelates stating that the Pope would no longer entertain questions about the validity of his 1984 consecration. The byword was a directive arrived from Rome, obliging each and every one to say and think, quote, "the consecration is done," unquote. Seeing that the Pope has done everything he could, heaven has deigned to accept his gesture. Here was the most ingenious explanation devised in the 60-odd years of the entire Fatima affair for their refusal to abide by the 1929 stipulation, and it is still working like a charm today. Notice the statement, "Seeing that the Pope has done everything he could, heaven has deigned to accept his gesture." In other words, John Paul II reasoned that because he had done everything humanly possible, and since it was not possible for him to mention the name of Russia in his 1984 consecration, since, as many claimed, following Donis, Russia would be offended and create more turmoil for the world, and because it was not possible to involve the bishops of the world, since, as many claimed, they were not completely following him, then heaven must promptly concede its demands and accept the Pope's menial 1984 consecration as the best that could be done under the circumstances. Never mind that the Pope never received confirmation from heaven that such a rationale was valid, nor did he even ask. In his mind, he was perfectly justified in making such a demand of heaven and having Sister Lucia change her whole story. Due to the political environment in which he was embroiled, he and he alone insisted that he must be the judge as to how the consecration should be conducted, and whether heaven should accept it. And he would no longer accept the contrary opinion of this unsophisticated peasant woman. After all, it could be reasoned that Sister Lucia neither had a good grasp of world political affairs nor any concept of the pressures the Pope was under in the turbulent 1980s. Hence, the Pope's mitigating circumstances rationale was the perfect ploy by which to silence the critics who insisted that Russia and the bishops had to be included. Who could argue with the Pope? For all intents and purposes, the ordeal was over, at least in the Pope's mind. The goalposts were finally moved, and all appeals to the contrary would be summarily dismissed after this ingenious rationale was implemented. The conglomeration of all these unfortunate events leaves us with the verdict that the real reason John Paul II did not see any peace in the world after his 1984 consecration is very simple. He did not do a valid consecration. He failed just as Pius XII failed in 1942, which led to the promulgation of World War II and the prolongation of it, and 1952, which led to the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and many other skirmishes. Both popes failed to mention Russia in the consecration and/or did not have a representative group of world's bishops take part in the consecration. No wonder there was no peace coming forth. Why would we expect heaven to answer such blatant disobedience? So in desperation, John Paul II made up his own method of appeasing heaven by bringing pagans to Italy to pray for peace, thereby denying heaven specific directives given at Fatima: consecrate Russia and pray only with bishops. Heaven never requested and never would request that the Pope pray with pagans for world peace. It also seems to be the case that John Paul II's disobedience led him to become infatuated with himself and his own ideas. Not only does he claim sole right to judge the validity of his consecration, not only does he claim sole right against all his papal predecessors to call pagans to pray to their false gods and permit a breaking of the first commandment, he also claims sole right to give himself top billing in the Fatima vision, asserting that he was the bishop dressed in white who was killed by a group of soldiers who fired bullets and arrows at him, one of the key figures in the Fatima vision of 1917. An interpretation that even the secular press thought was ludicrous, since it did not fit the details of the Fatima vision. Of course, departing from God's plan and implementing one's own is nothing new. The Old Testament is filled with stories in which God-appointed men failed to obey him. And St. Paul directs us to read those accounts as a solemn warning that we do not do the same. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 11. From Abraham's taking of Hagar as his wife, to Aaron worshiping the golden calf, to Moses striking the rock twice instead of once, to Solomon apostatizing with foreign nations at the end of his life, to Ahaz refusing to take God's help to defeat the cultic nations around him, the Jews were always making things more difficult. It stemmed from convincing themselves that they had a better method than God for curing the world's ills. In the process, they made it seem as if God forced them to climb high mountains and cross deep seas to do his will, but such was not the case. Neither mountains nor seas were in their way, only their pride, which led them to rely on everything humanly possible and yet deny everything divinely mandated. All that was needed was humble submission to God's word, and God would have taken care of the rest. The same was true when God requested the consecration of Russia in 1929. Humble obedience would have brought unimaginable peace on the earth. John Paul II's 7 interreligious prayer gatherings of 1986 through 2002 were the mountains and seas he created for himself. But right up to his death in 2005, he never attained the world peace he sought. But even more disastrous was that the church was falling apart at the seams. By 2002, when compared to the closing of Vatican II in 1965, 100,000 priests left the priesthood. The number of seminarians in the United States dropped over 90%, from 49,000 to 4,700. By 2020, it is estimated that 25% of all U.S. parishes will have no priest. The number of nuns dropped 60%. Half of all Catholic high schools were closed, and more are closing each year. Jesuit priests declined 40%. Jesuit seminarians, 89%. Franciscan priests declined 41%. Franciscan seminaries, 97%. Benedictine priests declined 40%, and Benedictine seminaries declined 93%. The situation is no better in Europe and South America, where the church is also facing an increasing Muslim population and Protestant proselytizing. In Mexico, the growth rate of atheists outpaces Catholics by 300%. In England, it is predicted at the present rate, the number of people attending Mass will drop to 0 by 2035. Worldwide, there are 412,000 priests as of 2010, down from 419,000 in 1970. That might not seem like much, except all these drastic declines are in the face of a Catholic population that has doubled from 653 million to 1.2 billion between the same years. There are presently 49,000 parishes without a resident priest, with a peak of 60,000 in 1995 in the reign of John Paul II. On and on we go with sad statistics. Whereas contraception, abortion, divorce, and homosexuality were relatively rare in the early 1960s, by 2002, they were common sins among Catholics. Every one of the 188 Catholic dioceses in the United States is facing claims against priests in alleged sexual relationships with children. Richard Sipe, a laicized priest and psychotherapist, after studying the issue for 40 years and reviewing thousands of case histories, estimates that 20% of Catholic priests are homosexual. He writes, quote, "This is a system. This is a whole community. You have many good people covering it up. There is a network of power. A lot of seminary rectors and teachers are part of it, and they move to chancery office positions and on to bishoprics. It's part of the ladder of success," unquote. Canon lawyer Father Thomas Doyle, who co-authored the 1985 Doyle-Moulton-Peterson report on sexual abuse among the clergy, estimated in 1990 that 3,000 priests were currently involved sexually with minors. They also estimated about 12,000 priests were involved with adult women, with thousands of paternity suits filed against them. They estimated that 6,000 priests were involved with adult men in homosexual relationships. The total of three categories is 21,000 priests in the United States out of 47,000, a total of 45% that are in some sexual sin. The stats are no better for pew dwellers. Newsweek reports that fully half, 51% of Catholics, say they would attend a church with an openly gay priest. 44% are in favor of gay marriages. 39% would accept a gay priest in a committed relationship. And 56% are in favor of allowing gays and lesbians to adopt children. Over 50% believe a Catholic can have an abortion without sin. This is the state of the church that John Paul II left to us. But all he had to do to help alleviate these problems was obey the simple request of Our Lady of Fatima to consecrate Russia to her Immaculate Heart, together with all the bishops. Instead, he consecrated himself and his humanistic views. Even Pope Benedict XVI, after flip-flopping the last 30 years on the relevance of Fatima, suggested during a recent trip to Fatima that there was a connection between the sex scandal of various Catholic clergy and the very warnings in the third secret of Fatima, which incidentally implies that the public did not receive the entire third secret, by the way. As we can easily see, such things can happen, can be hidden from the Catholic people by the very popes and bishops put in charge over them. Obviously, if the church hierarchy can cover up its own sex scandal for 40 years, It can also cover up the revelations of a Marian apparition for the same length of time. The implications of the failure of these last 7 popes to consecrate Russia are absolutely staggering. It casts a long shadow on much of what the Vatican has tried to do since 1929, especially during the reigns of the last 5 popes in the aftermath of Vatican II. It casts suspicion on the whole ecumenical effort begun in the early 1960s, for the Vatican was involved in a concerted effort to avoid the divine plan for the consecration of Russia and replace it by a man-made veneer of political ecumenism, then what we have been seeing coming from the Catholic Church for the last 50 years has little of God's sanction behind it, and hence it was doomed to failure from the start. No wonder our children are losing their faith, attending Catholic universities. No wonder, despite our billions of prayers and thousands of marches, abortion continues unabated throughout the world and only grows worse. And now we are waiting for the other shoe to drop as country after country begins to rethink its laws against homosexual marriage. The list of spiritual decimations goes on and on. But one thing we know for certain, God will not move unless the Pope obeys his command first. In one of the previous talks, someone mentioned that the SPLC is lying about us. And indeed they are. But we were the first to lie. And God's allowing them to lie against us. We've been having a lie for 84 years. Pope after pope has been lying to us about this consecration. And we're going to get upset because the SPLC is lying about us? No. We're the ones that were lying. We're going to get our just deserts of punishment. We've talked about doctors cutting out hearts of living people. We've talked about vaccines that kill. We've talked about the horrors of abortion. We've talked about homosexuality and its rise. Where do all these come from? As I said in the beginning, these are symptoms. These are the results of our sins. God allows this to take place. Nothing happens unless God allows it to take place. And these will come as punishments. These are the errors of Russia that have permeated the world. These are the things that God does against those who sin. And let me tell you something else. None of this is going to stop. Cutting out hearts, bad vaccines, abortion, homosexuality, it's going to continue, and it's going to get worse unless the Pope consecrates Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary with the bishops. Thank you very much.
I have come to warn the faithful to amend their lives and ask pardon for their sins. They must not continue to offend our Lord, who is already deeply offended.
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you. And I wrote back to him and I said, I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, rather Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before.
Our Lady said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, "I promise to assist at the hour of death with all the graces necessary for salvation. All those who on the first Saturday of 5 consecutive months go to confession, receive Holy Communion, recite 5 decades of the Rosary, and keep me company for 15 minutes while meditating on the mysteries of the Rosary, with the intention of making reparation to me." Our Lady said, "If my requests are not heeded, Russia will spread her errors throughout the world, raising up wars and persecutions against the Church. The good will be martyred. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, and various nations will be annihilated.